Is there more evidence of your thesis after this era? We go through what some call the Great Compression. Is there more
Right.
evidence of this notion that this was a sort of, I guess, obviously a once in a lifetime? I think we've more or less established that. I mean, there may be a couple of older people around, but more or less a once in a lifetime change. Why isn't, let's say, the Great Society or like that era? Why isn't that equivalent?
Well, I think it's part of it. So it's what we call the New Deal order, or the New Deal era. Really goes from the 30s through the 70s. That's when the political coalition of workers and liberals and white Southerners and minorities all work together in a very specific coalitional form. So when Johnson takes office, he basically sees himself as fulfilling the legacy of the New Deal. He is a New Dealer. He has a kind of a different outlook because he's in a booming economy, not a shrinking one. But he's part of that fabric, and even the civil rights workers are part of that fabric. But I think that's we're on a very different footing come the 1970s. I mean, if you think about something like, individualism, Herbert Hoover gave a speech called Rugged Individualism right before the crash happened. And then Roosevelt came along and said, hey, we're all in this together, right? And then World War II said, we're all in this together. And the Cold War said, we're all in this together. And then in the 70s, you have this revival of individualism, both a Reaganite version and then a new social movement version where everybody demands rights on, from a position of, gender or race or sexuality or whatever it is. But it ends up sort of being a rights-based, individual rights-based claim. And in both bookends to this, you see a much more virulent form of individualism, I think, at work than you do in this interim.
And I mean, had we seen this on the left? I mean, I've seen some critiques of that return, that blossoming of individualism on the left. Was it Curtis? The hypernormalization, Adam Curtis's documentary, sort of, talks about this phenomena, particularly in the context of sort of artists in New York, and people sort of trying to create an individual, a sense of individuality as being the most sort of freedom. Was there other history? Was there other examples on the left of this prior to the New Deal era? I mean, I can definitely see it on the right. It's nice to have individual rights if you're a robber baron, but I mean, was this on the left? That sort of like. Go ahead.
You mean prior to the New Deal?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was more of a mixed bag. I mean, you have, say, if you have somebody like, maybe your listeners have seen Reds with John Reed. The old movie about John Reed and the village at the time was full of sexual experimentation, individual artistic expression, and all this stuff. But it was also a time where socialists and communists and all this were alive and well and engaged in a variety of questions, and they were not as mutually exclusive a terrain, I think, as they are now. I think the big debate now, I hesitate to even bring this up, but between identity politics and class politics we see today, and the massive divide we see on this, I think, is indicative of kind of where we're at today, in which the virulence of this kind of individualism is still powerful. It is very powerful.
But where does that emanate from on the left? I mean, if there was at least an example or an indication that these things could coexist, and in fact, some would argue, look, living in a socialist society will give you more opportunity to pursue creativity. I mean, how did it split off?
That argument you just made is the one that progressives need to make, that there is more freedom involved in economic security than there is without it, that you will have more latitude and more freedom if you have health care. You can be more entrepreneurial. You can do anything you want if you're not wedded to your job for health care. I think that's a little sidebar there that I think is really important, and I really like the way you put that. But I think if you look at the success of the 30s and 40s, it really was around a collective agenda. It was about unionization and the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act and all the stuff that provided a secure economic platform. If you fast forward, the major breakthrough of the 1960s was the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? And that provided the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and all the stuff that protected individual rights to participate in society, which is a really important breakthrough, because the problem with the exceptional period was it was exclusive. There weren't immigrants. It was largely for white male industrial workers. It excluded African Americans. They needed to make those claims. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind those claims needed to be made. The question is now, how do we get back to having two conversations at once? One about redistribution and one about recognition and participation. And having both of those conversations now is where we need to be, because I think the post-60s, post-70s framework has really been about recognition, and that's been really important. But now it's time to really begin to go back and weave back in the old questions of redistribution in the way the 30s and 40s did.
Now, I know we're starting to move slightly out of your portfolio as a historian, but I mean, you write in your book that this is from your, I can't remember the specific words, but it was something to the effect of, from my political perspective, this is something of a tragedy, in that we will not be able to the shape will not be the gates will not fall away in such a way that this shape will be able to head through again. So what is, I mean,
that's right.
So let me just, with that said, and just, I don't want to harp on this too much, but when this individualism crept back up, right, and it was in service of in basically fulfilling a debt, essentially, that society owed, right? We needed to pay off these debts we had accrued in terms of not bringing everyone aboard during the New Deal. But did it necessarily have to then increase the sense of individualism on the left subsequent to that? Or is that just
not necessarily? I mean, if you track, say, where King was going to the Poor People's Campaign in '68, and economic questions were really boiling to the forefront of the civil rights struggle, I think or you said Cesar Chavez bringing together union power and Chicano civil rights, or the hospital workers in New York, or melding soul power and union power. There were a lot of possible linkages. But the way it broke by the time the 70s came along and really restricted economic opportunity in a very different way than the 1930s, right? I posit the 70s as sort of the anti-30s in a way. We saw a much more restricted version. We began to compete more for individual rights, to compete in this shrinking world of employment. And that's what sort of, I think, helped turn things sort of nasty. Rather than having the discussion about how do we divide the pie, we had a discussion about, okay, let's make sure everybody can compete for a slice. And I think that proved to be a bit of a dead end. But it's not to say that lots and lots and lots of people were not trying alternatives, right? It's just what won.
Right. Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos